Hi everybody, so my aim in this talk is to begin to think about the concept of cultural revival from several perspectives, working my way towards something like a theory of cultural revival that would respect the multiple global phenomena with which the term is associated during the period with which these workshops are concerned. So assuming that my initial research question is along the lines, what does it mean to think about cultural revival in Scotland in the context of the global dialectic of tradition and modernisation that also gives us the Irish Revival, the Arab Renaissance and the Hindu Renaissance, then before the work of historical comparison and differentiation that such a task would need, within and beyond the waves of Scottish Revival themselves, we need some conceptual clarification and a little bit of historical contextualisation. And those are what I set out thinking were limited aims, but they're actually rather demanding. Now, such clarification is urgently needed because of the ubiquity or even banalisation of the idea of revival in the writing of Scottish cultural history. And I think it's true to say that the history of interpretations of Scottish culture since the 1880s has been unthinkable without the idea of some form of revival. So revival was concretely identified with literature and other arts in the 1890s by Patrick Geddes, with literature, drama and the visual arts in the 20s and 30s by Denis Sora, Hugh MacDiarmid and many others. The continuation or decadence of the Renaissance movement has been taken, whether positively or negatively, by many scholars as the hallmark of the immediate post-war period, as indeed it was by contemporaries. Moreover, in recent decades, the idea of a second Renaissance or cultural revival associated with a devolutionary period has also, I think, been the dominant frame for analysis of the contemporary situation of Scottish culture. And that revival was originally identified with the decade following 1979, but the framing of this period has drifted backwards to the 1970s and even into the 1960s, which is now taken by critics as a point at which the interwar Renaissance is overcome with a new revival, which is the origin of the contemporary. So over the same period, the category of revival has been transferred from the artistic to the social and extended forward into the present day. It's become a commonplace for cultural change understood as visible self-determination or self-recognition to become an explanation of political change in Scotland. So this taken together generates what is an only apparent paradox, I think, of a tradition of cultural revival that never ends, but that never succeeds either, and of a continual process of revival that is always both evidence of political change in progress and promise of further revival to come. And taking this argument to something like its logical conclusion, in his recent The Wealth of the Nation, Cairns Craig kind of embraces this paradox by equating cultural revival not only with the recognition process and the kind of continual transmission of national self-consciousness, but with tradition itself. And he argues that a history of revivalism was, quote, the medium through which Scotland's difference and distinction was continually reasserted through the years of the incorporating union, which ought to have made Scotland an indistinguishable part of the cultural polity of the United Kingdom. So to set to one side what I think is the subjective appeal of revival as a narrative frame for the cultural historian, I think it's reasonable to suppose that the continuing ubiquity of the category of revival stems not from its empirical validity, which could only really make sense in relation to the inherently metaphysical idea of the rise or fall of culture, but from its significance as what the critical theorist Rainer Forst would call a justification narrative, i.e. it's a narrative which underpins an axiology of critical judgment premised on the articulation between a given field of literary and artistic production and a territorialised space of political reasons. And as is so often the case, the ubiquity of the category in cultural analysis may lead us both to overestimate its significance and underestimate its pervasiveness. So the possibility raised by Cairns Craig of simply identifying revival with tradition is a helpful starting point for clarification. Because it points on the one hand to a conception of tradition as an active task of renewal rather than as a passive reception of authoritative models and modes. So this perspective, and I have an enormous amount of sympathy with it, means that tradition must always be revival, the production of national cultural life always being its reproduction, and inheritance always being an active process of distinction and selection. But where revival has to be distinguished from tradition, I think, is in the kind of logic that's bound up with revival of a force of rupture and discontinuity that simply thinking about a continuing tradition of revival cannot accommodate. And ultimately, I would suggest that a continuous tradition of revivals produces a form of stasis, the reinvention in historiographical discourse of what we're familiar with in philosophy or religion as destiny or fate, as the eternal return of the same. And there's a parallel here, I think, to the way that the discourse of the contemporary in recent criticism has tended to produce rather than reflect paralysis of periodization and of historical understanding. So 2 key points at this stage. Revival is about the future, not the past, and as I'll show it invents usable pasts on which to think a future. But revival has to be distinguished from tradition itself because of this force of rupture. So this gives us a starting point, probably, for our analysis, that a usable concept of cultural revival has to be more specific than the category of tradition on the one hand, and to the extent that this is possible, and that's a question that's open for discussion, it has to be distinct from the religious or metaphysical concept of revival or return, even though cultural revival may include religious, spiritual, or philosophical phenomena. So that's a kind of secularization conundrum which would need to be unpicked in a full version of this project. So broadly speaking, I want to define the difference as follows. So in contradistinction from the idea of tradition, Renaissance or revival has 2 conditions. The resumption or renewal of something follow its loss, forgetting, interruption, or decay. Now this isn't a feature of revival in this period that we're talking about, and it can be traced back to the original self-consciousness of the Renaissance project itself, i.e. the birth of the kind of periodization of certainly of European history into ancient, medieval and modern. And as Geoffrey Pearl puts it, a very perceptive writer on these issues, the perception of division is a function of Renaissance, the humanists' project. Discontinuity was their ambition. So this helps remind us that revival isn't just premised on identification of a rupture or break, but creates rupture. That's part of its project. And I think it's true to say that, like other inextricably modern categories, revival or Renaissance can't be thought without thinking through or even working through this kind of characteristic ambivalence, renewal but rupture at the same time. Now, it's this temporal structure of revival which connects it so kind of drastically to the idea of modern art and literature in general, meaning post-Renaissance. And it links it in turn to the modern epoch as the era of historical consciousness in which, through resources provided from the past, the present is constructed as the site in which the future will emerge, and in which history can be envisaged as the sequence of past presents, and in which alternative pasts, now lost, have been mined for alternative futures. And as we all know, this generates a kind of characteristic pathos, that the contingency of the present, the mourning of the past or the loss of the past, and a space of hope and possibility projected into the future. Now, if we follow Benjamin's recognition that, as Peter Osborne summarizes it, and I quote, "Modernity's present is defined historically not just by its negation of the past, but by its negation of the past form of temporal negation, tradition," we might conclude that revival is the inevitable condition of modern, i.e. self-consciously new cultural production since the European Renaissance onwards. And here we kind of can identify within revival maybe 2 forms of kind of counter-revolution directed towards kind of modern historical self-consciousness. One would be historicism, simply the restoration of tradition, which would be the management or outright denial of the ruptural temporal process of modernity itself in the production of a kind of narrative order. So historicism is bound up with revival and is on the side of narrative. But there's another strand in it which we could see as a kind of modernist impulse, which is the impulse to break with a failed tradition, to rupture with tradition, and which we can take as a sort of affirmation of the negation in the attempt to counter other tendencies of the age. So while there's been a tendency, and I think this is true of criticism in Scotland, to distinguish, if you like, a true modern from a revival impulse, what I'm suggesting is that these can't be easily separated, and that we're likely to find them bound up within the discourses of revival and within the artistic projects associated with or premised on the force of revival. And that may be the case far beyond even where there's a kind of obvious or self-conscious relation to a kind of revival movement, that this may be more of an underpinning logic of the cultural production of the period that we're interested in. And many of the kind of familiar and rather repetitive features of the debate around cultural revival follow from this structure. So on the one hand, the present must always be constructed as the site of failed tradition, otherwise there wouldn't be a need for kind of artists and intellectuals to renew tradition. Popular taste always tends to become kitsch, depraved, and other intellectual or artistic elites and tastemakers have to be kind of stigmatized as depraved cosmopolitans or nativist cranks. And I want to stress the solidarity between these two figures. And again, I'm trying to complicate our tendency to want to oppose international to national or modern to revival. These are all the logic that mixes and scrambles these in different combinations is what I think we have to get to the heart of before we kind of start to distinguish the different forms this takes. So the results of all of this is that we get a set of features which might in turn become the objects of a historical project, such as the one that's being proposed by Scott and Michael and is the subject of these workshops, which is to say that we should simply expect to find and expect to have to differentiate between a succession of revivals characterized by competition between and within different discourses of revival. Secondly, or B, a tendency for revival to degenerate into mannerism within literary and artistic fields polarized between avant-garde and kitsch. So revivalism can really quickly degenerate into kind of cliche or kitsch. And then thirdly, C, resemblance and parallelism between forms of critical critique which may come from very different political perspectives. And needless to say, I think the kind of key critical and analytical move that's being proposed by Michael and Scott and that we're exploring is a really key one, which is to displace the idea of revival from the explanatory role it has tended to assume in the study of modern Scottish culture, and which I think of as simply a narrative trope that's been regularly fallen back on by writers. We've moved it from the explanatory role and foregrounded it as the phenomena which has to be explained. Not why was there a revival, but why should so many people talk about revival, and why is that conversation ongoing? Now, having clarified a little bit the temporal dynamic of revival as closer to repetition forward rather than repetition backwards, and reiterated this kind of temporality of revival as the negation of past revivals, I think now we can begin to unpick the link between revival and critique, between renewal and rupture within the context of modernism. And I'm going to conventionally assume that to be broadly an aesthetic and political project that emerges within European and North American societies within the time frame spanning 1850 to 1950. And I'll leave open the question about the global extension of this category. And it's the force of critique within modernist cultural revival which is most often effaced when revival is treated as an empirical, historical project. So again, just to summarize a couple of key points at this stage, specific revival and specific forms of critique will be linked in any project of revival, and the key question that we now move on to is whether there's a distinctively modernist, i.e. post-romantic, project of revival, which we would have to understand, in line with what I've said so far, as a counter-reaction to earlier forms of revival, taking these as a kind of constitutive feature of modern literary and artistic tendencies, meaning the whole in the entirety of post-Renaissance world. So the key point that I'd stress to kind of tie these strands together, give a kind of preliminary answer to the distinctive object of revival in the context of this project, is that it's not revival, but the term culture, which is going to be the decisive factor. So what characterises, this is my kind of gambit or hypothesis I suppose, modernist varieties of cultural revival is not going to be found simply on the side of the aesthetic critique of modernity, i.e. the generalised romantic complaint about the banality of commercial life or the appeal to art as an alternative sphere of non-alienated experience. Those concepts have deeper roots in the 18th century. Rather, the distinctive feature of revival in this period with which the project is concerned is that it is conceived as cultural. And I'll kind of maybe unpick this in questions if people want to talk about it. We might say that revival in this period is conceived not as the revival of a specific artistic style or a particular institution, but as the revival of revival, or as the Renaissance of Renaissance itself. So that's what I want to just finally kind of conclude by discussing a little bit. So what I'm suggesting, I think, is that the modernist logic of Renaissance in this kind of context departs from the longer standing classicism of the humanist tradition and from the romantic models, what we know the Northern Homers, invented in the 18th century as the basis for vernacular literature and historiography. And they depart from these logics at the point where they refer not to the revival of antiquity, i.e. a past of a culture, but to the revival of the Renaissance itself. So it's a kind of revolution within the modern, a kind of rupture within the kind of self-consciousness of modern time. And what separates the idea of cultural revival, i.e. there's a totalizing emphasis in culture, from the revivals of older artistic styles or from reference back to particular traditions of eloquence, forms of science, inquiry or understanding, is an emphasis on the self-consciousness of cultural revival, and ultimately on cultural revival as a whole, in distinction from the revival of a particular domain. So it's a culture of revival as the object of cultural revival, conceived as a unique kind of upsurge of both artistic and intellectual flourishing that reflects not a particular strand within a social world, but kind of fertilizes the whole world itself. And the key source for this is, I'm suggesting, is the revival of kind of historiographical interest in the idea of Renaissance, which kind of comes up with Michelet in the 1830s, kind of re-puts the term back into circulation. And then in 1860, Burckhardt's enormously influential civilization of the Renaissance in Italy kind of interposes itself and disrupts the way we think about revival. So it's not classicism itself, but the idea of a self-conscious resurgence of cultural life, drawing on precedents, that becomes the significant feature. And this makes both classical and vernacular sources equally usable. And furthermore, just as the Renaissance comes to see itself not as imitation, but as a kind of a fuller vindication of the knowledge and arts of the classical world beyond the limits that they encountered, I'd suggest that the modernist idea of cultural revival draws on a category which wasn't available to the Renaissance to present itself as a perfection of Renaissance, and that would be the category of culture. And as an ideal type for this period, cultural revival, in the sense we're kind of using it, is always going to mean vernacular cultural revival, even if the vernacular is not a popular language or even a living language. The key thing here, and this is what I'm getting at with vernacular, is that it's been constructed in relation to the distinctive idea of the national community or the nation state, which is a vision of the congruence of social, institutional, linguistic, and symbolic practices. So like when we use the word culture in general, the scales are already being tipped towards holism in a kind of sociological qua political project. And as ever, when we come across the category culture, we find that aesthetic categories, variety and unity, so difference within the space of the culture, closure and kind of narrative trajectory, are being projected onto social spheres, including the state, where they may simply not be appropriate. And what this means is that whether it's nativist or transnational, whether it's conceived as within a bounded political territory or as diasporic, cultural revival is going to be a counterfactual or utopian aesthetic political project premised on the possibility of this kind of vertical integration of and single boundedness of different types of social sphere. So it's kind of counterfactual against the systems differentiation that characterizes modern societies. And I've begun to stress the significance of vernacular cultural renewal, partly to highlight the dependence of this idea of cultural revival on, again, an earlier idea emerging in the 18th century of culture as the distinctive features of a society in contradistinction from others within a system of states, and the Romantic idea of culture as expressive of individual and social forms. So tying these Romantic qualities and categories to revival as a trope of aesthetic and secular critique generates, I think, this modernist category of cultural renaissance, which depends on the emergence of the autonomy of the art system from the social. And this would be another way of analysing that political triangulation of revival, which is to say that it's only to the extent that some specific cultural practice, which could be religious, it could be artistic, it could be literary, is identified as expressive of the whole social body, that the pathological identification of its loss or failure and the call for its renewal carries any urgency. So that's why cultural revival becomes such a critical political category in this period, because it's tied to this totalizing sort of sociological critique. So to kind of sum up, I've sketched an account of cultural revival which emphasizes a little bit the tension between modernism and historicism, thinking now that these align with revival and rupture on the one hand, and this idea of culture on the other. And my hypothesis is that this can account for the specificity of the articulation of the general category of literary artistic revival within this period. And it might suggest, I think, that the opposite of revivalism is not modernism. I've been stressing that throughout, I think, but skepticism about the convergence of aesthetic and politics, and about the projection of rhetorical and aesthetic categories onto historical narrative. And the irony will be that that skepticism can only discover itself as a kind of reinvention of a humanist classicism, which is itself becomes a form of revival. So revival is a logic we can't really escape. This also, I think, this analysis hints at an explanation of why the characteristic tropes of revival writing, and I think you could show this through certainly the 20s, 30s and 40s in Scotland, are the tension between the artist as the figure of an exemplary individual, i.e. the full flourishing individual within a kind of fully realised culture, or as a token of the possibility of a realised culture, and then the social world characterised in post-romantic terms as the graceless, worn-out, commercialised present, and B, the construction of figures of integration of art into social worlds, because that's the premise for the renewal of culture, the cultural revival itself. And this often appears nostalgic and has been stigmatized as that because it has to rely on kind of romantic visions of a pre-modern art, i.e. going back before the autonomy of art, which is now being understood as alienation of art from society. And so figures like storytelling or folk song become very powerful, the alternative being a kind of dystopian disenchantment where art is seen as incapable of being reintegrated into modern life. And finally, I want to conclude, I guess, just by saying that these logics begin to suggest why the idea of cultural revival, leaving aside its kind of convenience to historians, is relatively impervious to critique. And by critique, I mean forms of analysis which aim at replacing illusion with truth, simplicity with complexity, or unity with multiplicity. Revival is predicated on the negation of tradition and on a repetition forward, some might say the invention of tradition, which under any historical or political analysis can be made to yield up a kind of absence at its origin, because the force of rupture within revival is premised on that break. So we can always show that revival is in some way fictioning, poeticizing. And at another level of analytic generality, once we kind of extend this into questions of historical time itself, it will reveal a structure of lack which reigns over or kind of governs the specific lack that the revivalist is focusing on. But what I'd suggest, I guess, is that this kind of impropriety or absence, this sort of lack of foundation, a contingency even, cannot be the focus of a critique because it stems from this process of temporalization itself, and because the form of critique is itself a modernist cultural project caught up within the same structure. So I'm suggesting, I guess, that we can't simply step outside revival and hoping that our revival of the category of revival as a category of analysis may effect a kind of displacement within this problem, and that might release new possibilities for thinking through the problems that we're discussing today.